The air was cooling after a long, hot summer day, the sky still carrying the faint glow of sunset as porch lights flickered on across the neighborhood. For the Whitmore family, nothing about that night suggested anything unusual. Dinner had been finished, dishes stacked neatly in the sink, and the children were settling into their nightly routines. At the center of that home was their mother, a woman known by everyone in town for her warmth, her consistency, and the quiet rhythm of her habits. She was the type of person who waved at the mailman, who checked in on elderly neighbors, and who never failed to take her short evening walk when the day came to a close. Her walk was never far, never longer than 20 minutes. She liked to circle the block, passing the elementary school playground and cutting back through the small wooded trail that lined the southern end of the neighborhood. Neighbors often saw her with her hands tucked into her jacket pockets, her pace calm and unhurried, sometimes pausing to nod hello to the people watering lawns or walking dogs. She was predictable, reliable, and deeply rooted in routine. And it was that very predictability that made what happened next so chilling. Around 7:30 p.m., she left the house as usual, telling her husband she would be back shortly. She wasn't carrying a phone. She never did on these short walks. She wasn't carrying a purse, only her house keys and the small charm bracelet she wore every day, a delicate piece that her children had saved up to buy for her birthday years before. For the Whitmore children, that bracelet was one of the strongest symbols of their mother. It jingled softly when she gestured with her hands. It caught the light when she tucked their hair behind their ears. It was always there. And so when she stepped off the front porch and disappeared into the night, no one thought twice about it. The first sign that something was wrong came less than an hour later. 8 o'clock passed, then 8:30. Her husband, glancing at the clock and then out the window, began to grow uneasy. She was never late. He walked out onto the porch, scanning the sidewalks, expecting to see her coming around the corner as she always did. The street was empty. By 9 o'clock, when she still hadn't returned, unease hardened into worry. He called a couple of neighbors, asked if they had seen her on the trail. They hadn't. One neighbor mentioned seeing her earlier near the elementary school, but that was almost an hour and a half ago. The children began asking questions. Where was Mom? Why wasn't she home yet? At first, the husband tried to stay calm, telling them she probably stopped to talk to someone. But by the time the clock neared 10, he knew something wasn't right. This was a woman who never missed a bedtime routine, who never failed to check in. Something had interrupted that routine tonight, and no one could explain what. By 10:30, he called the local police. At first, the officer suggested she might have gotten distracted, perhaps gone to visit a friend, but the family insisted this wasn't like her. She didn't go places without telling anyone. She didn't just wander off. Within the hour, 2 officers were circling the block with flashlights, checking the wooded trail where she usually cut through. There were no signs of a struggle, no discarded belongings, no scuff marks in the dirt. The trail looked untouched, silent, as though no one had passed through it all. Neighbors began stepping out of their homes as word spread. Some brought out flashlights, forming small search groups. They checked yards, sheds, even the small drainage ditch at the edge of the park. People kept repeating the same thing. She was always so dependable. If she wasn't home, something had happened. The unease that first started inside her family's living room now spread through the neighborhood like a slow, chilling fog. By midnight, the search had grown. Police expanded their perimeter, knocking on doors, asking if anyone had seen or heard something unusual. A few people reported hearing a car drive unusually fast down a side road around the time she would have been walking. Another neighbor thought they'd seen a shadowy figure near the trail entrance, but couldn't recall details. Nothing was concrete, nothing was certain. But one fact settled over everyone present. A mother who should have been home hours ago had vanished without a trace. For her children, the night remains etched in memory. They remember waiting by the window, straining their eyes toward the street, hoping each passing set of headlights would reveal their mother's face. They remember the look on their father's face when the police told him they were filing a missing persons report. They remember how the house, so full of life only hours earlier, fell into silence as though it had been drained of its center. The disappearance was immediate, inexplicable, and profoundly out of character. And for investigators, that very ordinariness This was not a woman with a chaotic life, not someone likely to vanish by choice. Meant that from the very beginning, the case was chilling. A walk she had taken hundreds of times without incident had become the moment she slipped from the world without explanation. That night would mark the start of something the family and the community could never undo. It was the first step into a mystery that would stretch years, fracture trust, and haunt everyone who knew her. And though the search began quickly, no one yet realized how little the hours ahead would yield, and how the silence of that night would grow into a silence lasting far longer than anyone could have imagined. The first hours after her disappearance were filled with a kind of desperation that only comes when a family knows deep down that something is terribly wrong. By the time the clock passed midnight, her husband had called in every neighbor he could reach, begging them to help search. The wooded trail that bordered the neighborhood, usually a place where children played and joggers passed by during the day, was now swarming with flashlights cutting through the darkness. The sound of leaves crunching under hurried steps filled the air as people called her name, their voices echoing back without response. Officers began moving quickly, understanding the urgency. They checked the elementary schoolyard where a neighbor last saw her, combing over the swings and benches with beams of light. They walked along the sidewalks leading out of the neighborhood, scanning for anything dropped or disturbed. When that yielded nothing, they turned their attention to the trail itself. The ground was soft in places, damp from rain earlier in the week, but there were no footprints distinct enough to suggest a struggle, no broken branches or dragged marks, nothing that screamed foul play. It was as though she had walked into the darkness and simply dissolved into it. Her husband grew increasingly frantic, pacing between the house and the search groups, unable to settle in one place. He returned home several times to check if she had walked in without anyone noticing. But each time he found the same emptiness, the light still on, her shoes gone from the mat, her jacket missing from its hook. Their children sat together on the couch, too scared to sleep, listening to the commotion outside and asking questions he couldn't answer. For them, every minute that passed made the absence sharper, more unbearable. By 1 a.m., the police called in reinforcements. More officers arrived, and with them came dogs trained to track scents. They brought the mother's scarf from the hallway closet, letting the dogs smell it before unleashing them toward the trail. The family and neighbors held their breath, waiting for the barking that might signal a lead. But the dogs pulled forward only a short distance before circling in confusion, losing the trail near the school. It was as though her scent ended abruptly, as though something had interrupted her walk at that precise spot. Detectives canvassed houses door to door, knocking softly even at that late hour, asking residents if they had seen anything. A car idling, an unfamiliar figure, any sound out of the ordinary. Most shook their heads, apologizing, while others recalled vague impressions, a vehicle speeding down the road earlier, or what sounded like hurried footsteps near the trail. None of it was definitive. Every detail was uncertain, half-remembered, and investigators struggled to separate fact from rumor. Meanwhile, the wooded trail became the focal point. Volunteers spread out in lines, sweeping the area carefully with beams of light, searching ditches and brush for any sign of torn fabric, discarded belongings, or signs of violence. Each time someone stopped to bend down, hearts froze, but nothing they found connected back to her. The absence of evidence unsettled investigators deeply. Cases like this often revealed at least some trace, an object dropped, a mark left behind. But here there was nothing. Inside the house, officers asked her husband about recent behavior. Had she seemed stressed? Had she argued with anyone? Was there any reason she might have left on her own? He insisted no. She was steady, happy in her routines, devoted to her family. Nothing suggested she would vanish voluntarily. Friends and neighbors who gathered outside echoed the same thing. She was a mother who lived for her children, who rarely went anywhere alone except that short walk each evening. The thought of her abandoning that life willingly seemed impossible. By 3 a.m, the search radius expanded. Patrol cars swept the streets leading out of town, officers checking gas stations and convenience stores for any sight of her on surveillance cameras. The trail remained lit by flashlights as volunteers pressed on, fatigue setting in but determination pushing them forward. The husband stood on the porch, silent now, staring down the street as though waiting for her to appear at any moment. That stillness, the moment when panic gives way to dread, was noticed by everyone who passed. Detectives gathered briefly in the front yard to discuss what they had. The facts were troubling. A woman had disappeared during a short walk on familiar ground, leaving behind no signs of struggle, no belongings, and no clear trail. In missing person cases, the first hours are critical, and already those hours were slipping away. They faced the possibility that if she had been taken, she was far from town by now. The weight of that reality pressed heavily on them as they considered what to do next. By dawn, exhaustion mixed with disbelief. Neighbors staggered home to rest, promising to return later that day. The children, finally too tired to fight sleep, dozed off on the couch. Her husband remained awake, pacing, refusing to leave the door. The officers promised they would not stop, that daylight would bring more resources, more organized searching. But the unease among them was undeniable. In those first hours, what struck everyone most was not just her absence. It was how clean, how eerily empty the trail felt, as if the ground itself had hidden the truth. That silence, that lack of evidence, would become the defining feature of the case. A mystery that no one yet realized was only just beginning. In the days following her disappearance, the investigation widened beyond the immediate search zones. With no trace of her on the trail, police turned their focus toward tips from the community. The first came from a man who claimed he saw a dark sedan idling near the school around the time she was last seen. He described it as an older model with tinted windows, but when pressed, he couldn't remember the license plate, nor could he be sure of the exact color. Detectives canvassed nearby towns, pulling traffic camera footage where available, but the lead fizzled quickly. There were dozens of cars that could match such a vague description, and none connected directly to her. Another tip surfaced from a teenager who told police he noticed a man walking near the wooded trail that evening, someone he didn't recognize from the neighborhood. The boy described him as tall, with a hood pulled tight around his face. Officers followed up, checking with local businesses and asking if anyone knew of a stranger passing through, but nothing solid developed. No one else could confirm seeing this mysterious figure, and without corroboration, the report faded into yet another dead end. As word spread, the possibility of a domestic issue began to circulate. Investigators, cautious but thorough, began looking more closely at her home life. Was the marriage stable? Had there been arguments that neighbors overheard? People in the community began whispering, some pointing out that her husband seemed unusually stoic during searches, others convinced his emotion was genuine but broken. Detectives pressed him on details, but his alibi, that he was home with the children during her walk, checked out. Phone records, bank statements, and interviews revealed no hidden double life, no obvious motive. Still, suspicion lingered, hanging over the family as quietly as the missing woman's absence. The weeks dragged on, and each new theory seemed to carry less weight than the last. Some believed she'd been abducted by a passing motorist, snatched up quickly and forced into a vehicle near the school. Others thought perhaps she had fallen, injured herself in a hidden part of the trail, and was simply missed during the initial searches. Teams scoured the brush, ditches, and shallow creek beds for days, but they found nothing. The lack of evidence became suffocating. No purse, no phone, no keys, not even the charm bracelet that never left her wrist. Detectives called in state investigators, hoping fresh eyes might catch something overlooked, but the state team left with the same conclusion. She was simply gone. Without evidence, even the best theories carried no weight in court, and without answers, the family was left suspended in uncertainty. Meanwhile, the community, once unified in grief, began to fracture under the strain of suspicion. Neighbors eyed one another differently. People remembered small details and began reinterpreting them. That one man who always walked his dog late at night, had he been near the trail at the wrong time? That couple down the block who seemed private, were they hiding something? The sense of safety that had once defined the town began to erode. Parents no longer let their children walk alone. Porch lights stayed on longer, and front doors were double-checked before bed. For detectives, the hardest part was momentum. In the first days, they had dozens of officers, volunteers, and tips pouring in by the hour. But as the second week came and went with no breakthrough, energy dwindled. People had to return to work. The press, once camped outside the family's home, slowly moved on. Detectives continued running down every lead, but each ended the same way: inconclusive, uncertain, unresolved. The family, exhausted by interviews and the constant swirl of speculation, began to retreat inward. They maintained their innocence, but the pressure weighed heavily. The children were shielded as much as possible, yet they couldn't escape the whispers at school or the pitying glances from neighbors. Her husband tried to remain steady, speaking to police whenever asked, but the lack of answers gnawed at him. He too had begun to wonder if the truth was somewhere close, just beyond their sight, but forever out of reach. By the end of the first month, the case had settled into a grim rhythm. Leads appeared, detectives chased them, and each collapsed into nothing. The town that once rallied around the family now struggled to keep faith that answers would come. Every day without resolution deepened the void she had left behind. The only certainty was that a woman had walked out of her home one summer evening and never returned, leaving behind theories, rumors, and a trail that seemed determined to tell no story at all. As the weeks gave way to months, the energy of the search began to shift. What started as a desperate hunt for a missing mother gradually turned into an investigation pointed inward. With no solid evidence of an abduction and no confirmed sightings of a stranger, detectives returned to the most statistically common answer in cases like this: the family. If she hadn't been taken by someone passing through, maybe the answer had been inside the house all along. Her husband, already worn down by grief and endless questioning, became the central focus. Detectives revisited his timeline in painstaking detail. They asked again and again what he had been doing when his wife left, what he noticed, whether their marriage had shown cracks. They looked for inconsistencies, tiny slips in his recounting of that night. But each time his story held firm. He had been at home with the children, who confirmed it. His phone records showed no suspicious calls. His bank accounts revealed nothing unusual. And yet, suspicion lingered, stubborn and heavy. The community fed that suspicion. Rumors crept across town, whispered at grocery stores, and murmured in church pews. Some suggested the marriage had been troubled, that arguments had been overheard late at night. Others believed she had been secretly unhappy and had chosen to leave her family behind. Each story fed into the uncertainty, even when there was no proof. People began asking one another if they had ever really known the couple at all. The children, teenagers now old enough to sense the weight of every sideways glance, found themselves caught in the middle. Police questioned them directly, asking about fights, about tension in the home, about whether their father ever raised his voice or his hand. Each time they defended him, insisting their parents had the same disagreements as any couple, but nothing more. Still, investigators pressed, looking for cracks in their accounts. The pressure left the children withdrawn, retreating from friends who didn't know what to say, classmates who whispered behind their backs. The husband tried to carry on with daily life, but the absence of his wife never left him. The house felt hollow, her belongings untouched in the bedroom, her presence frozen in time. At night he replayed the evening in his head, searching for some detail he had missed, something that might explain what had happened once she stepped off the porch. But in the eyes of many around him, he was no longer just a grieving husband. He was a possible suspect. Detectives searched the house again, this time with greater scrutiny. They combed through the basement, the garage, the backyard shed. They collected samples, lifted carpet fibers, and used chemical sprays to detect traces of blood. Each test came back clean. There was no sign of violence, no hidden evidence to suggest the home had been a crime scene. The more thoroughly they searched, the more frustrating the lack of results became. Still, the cloud over the family grew. Some neighbors began to distance themselves, uneasy about the possibility of living next to a family hiding something terrible. Others offered quiet support, but even then there was hesitation in their voices, as though they too had begun to question what they once believed was impossible. For the family, that social isolation deepened the wound left by her absence. They were losing not only a wife and mother, but also the community that once felt like an extension of their home. By the end of the year, the case had stalled completely. Detectives continued to check in, but the questions felt recycled, the theories recycled too. The family was exhausted, worn down by suspicion, yet no closer to answers. No evidence had surfaced to implicate anyone, and yet the weight of uncertainty hung over them like a sentence without an end date. In the quiet of their home, the children sometimes asked their father if people would ever stop suspecting them, if the whispers would ever fade. He had no answer. The truth was that until someone uncovered what really happened on that summer evening, suspicion would always be the shadow that followed them. And though the investigation officially remained open, it was clear to everyone that momentum was gone. The town had shifted back to its routines, but behind closed doors, the questions still lingered, circling back always to the same house, the same family, and the same missing mother. As the months slipped into years, the case that had once consumed the town gradually lost its urgency. The search parties ended, the reporters stopped showing up, and the once busy command center at the local station emptied out. What had begun with late-night flashlights and endless questions became little more than a few dusty binders filed away in a cold case cabinet. For the family, the silence was unbearable at first, but over time it hardened into something even more difficult to carry. Normalcy shaped around absence. Holidays were the most difficult. Her place at the table remained untouched that first Thanksgiving, her children staring at the empty chair while relatives tried to keep conversation light. Christmas came with stockings hung on the mantel, hers included, because the children couldn't bear to leave it out. By the second year, they stopped hanging it, not because they had forgotten her, but because the sight of it was too painful. Birthdays were no better. The day once filled with laughter and small family traditions turned into a quiet vigil, the children lighting a candle and whispering wishes that their mother would somehow come home. The house itself never really changed. Her clothes remained in the closet. Her shoes lined neatly by the door. The charm bracelet she loved, the one that should have been with her that night, never turned up, and so it became something of a ghostly reminder for her children. They swore they could still hear its faint jingling when they walked into her room, as though their minds refused to accept that she was gone. Her husband kept her belongings exactly as she left them, unable to box them away, convinced that doing so would be admitting she was never coming back. Detectives rotated on and off the case as the years passed. The first investigators who had walked the trail with flashlights in those early hours eventually retired. Younger officers inherited the file, but without new leads, they could do little more than glance through old reports. Forensic technology advanced, and occasionally samples from the scene were retested, but they yielded nothing new. Each time the family was called with the promise of fresh analysis, their hopes surged, only to collapse again when results came back inconclusive. The community, too, adapted in its own way. In the beginning, neighbors had rallied, organizing vigils, fundraisers, and poster campaigns. But as the years rolled by, those gatherings dwindled. People had lives to live, jobs to keep, families to raise. The posters faded, the vigils became sparse, and eventually, only the closest friends continued to visit the family on anniversaries. The sense of collective urgency had melted into a quiet, almost embarrassed distance. For many in town, the case had become something they spoke of rarely, usually in hushed tones, like a scar best left untouched. For her children, growing up without answers was a wound that never healed. They carried her absence into every milestone, graduations, birthdays, even small moments like learning to drive or playing in the school band. Each accomplishment was dulled by the fact that she wasn't there to see it. Photos were taken with forced smiles, her absence visible in the way the family stood, always leaving a space where she should have been. The teenagers who once sat on the couch waiting for their mother to return became young adults, marked by grief that no one around them could quite understand. Her husband aged under the weight of it. Lines deepened on his face, not only from time but from the constant stress of carrying suspicion he could never fully shake. Some people still whispered, even years later. Others looked at him with pity, which in some ways was worse. He worked, he paid bills, he did everything to keep his children moving forward, but the quiet inside the house grew louder with each passing year. It was a silence that never left, settling into the walls, into the spaces where her voice used to fill the air. By the 7th year, the case file was thick with dead ends, but thin on real evidence. Detectives admitted quietly to one another that unless something new surfaced, the truth might never be found. The case was still technically open, but for all practical purposes, it was cold. The family lived in that limbo, not knowing whether she had chosen to leave, whether she had been taken, or whether she had met some fate too dark to imagine. Hope remained, but it was fragile, like glass held together by the finest threads of denial. And yet, even as the years passed and hope dimmed, the feeling never fully went away. For the family, for the community, and even for the investigators, there was always the quiet sense that something had been missed, that the answer was close, hidden somewhere they had overlooked. No one knew that in just a short time, the silence of those years would be broken, not by a tip or a sighting, but by something unearthed in the very place they thought they knew best. 8 years had passed since the summer night when she vanished, long enough for the case to slip from the headlines and lodge itself as a quiet scar in the town's memory. The family had carried on as best they could, her children now on the cusp of adulthood, their mother's absence woven into the fabric of who they had become. The home remained frozen, her belongings untouched, the silence unchanged. For the police, the case was filed under open but inactive, one of many unsolved disappearances that lingered in the background while newer crimes demanded attention. It seemed destined to remain there until a shift in the department altered its trajectory. A new detective, younger but seasoned in cold case work, had recently been transferred to the county. He had built a reputation for persistence, for refusing to accept the easy conclusion that time erased possibility. When he took over the neglected files, hers was one of the first to draw his eye. There was something about its ordinariness that unsettled him, a woman on a routine walk, disappearing without a sound, with no evidence left behind. He believed such cases weren't impossible. They were unfinished. He started by reading every line of the original reports. Night after night. He sat in his office, highlighters marking passages others had skimmed over, sticky notes covering the margins with questions. He reconstructed the timeline, comparing each witness statement, each theory that had surfaced in the weeks after her disappearance. He noticed discrepancies, tiny ones, not glaring enough to spark suspicion at the time, but enough to gnaw at him now. One witness had reported a sedan parked near the school, but the time he gave was slightly earlier than recorded by others. Another mentioned hearing footsteps near the trail, though the detail had been dismissed for being vague. He found notes of interviews that seemed rushed, questions that had gone unanswered simply because no one had pressed harder. What struck him most was how quickly the focus had narrowed onto the family once the early leads collapsed. To him, it felt as though the broader picture, the possibility of someone passing through, of an outsider, had been abandoned too soon. With new technology at his disposal, he requested evidence from storage. Items collected from the trail, from her home, from her personal belongings were retested in a lab. Forensic techniques had advanced, and DNA profiles could now be lifted from surfaces once considered useless. Weeks passed while results were processed, each day tightening the anticipation. When the reports came back, they were inconclusive but intriguing. Partial profiles that didn't match anyone in her family, trace fibers of unknown origin. Nothing definitive, but enough to suggest that someone else had been near her that night. Around the same time, a new tip landed on his desk. An older man who had moved away years earlier called the department after reading about the detective's renewed interest in the case. He recalled that back in the summer of the disappearance, a stranger had been spotted around town, a man no one knew, staying in cheap motels, often seen wandering near the wooded area. At the time, it had seemed unimportant, just another drifter passing through. But the memory had stayed with him, resurfacing now with a clarity that felt impossible to ignore. The detective tracked down records from that year, combing through motel registries, receipts, and archived reports of transient arrests. Slowly, a faint outline began to form. There had been a man, unnamed and unclaimed, drifting through the county around the very week she vanished. No one knew where he came from or where he went afterward, but his presence in the small town, coinciding so perfectly with her disappearance, reignited the detective's determination. For the family, the news of the reopened investigation was bittersweet. Hope was something they had learned to guard carefully, because each time it had flared in the past, it had been extinguished just as quickly. Still, hearing that someone was digging again, that someone believed the case was not over, breathed life into corners of their grief that had gone quiet. They agreed to new interviews, answered questions that had been asked 100 times before, and allowed their home to be re-examined. The community, too, felt the shift. Conversations that had grown hushed over the years began again. Neighbors who had long stopped mentioning her name now spoke of her openly, reminded that the mystery remained unsolved. Some wondered if the stranger in town had been the answer all along. Others still clung to old suspicions about the family. But whatever side they leaned toward, the renewed investigation reopened wounds that had never fully healed. For the detective, though, the case was no longer a dormant file. It was a puzzle missing only a few pieces, and he believed those pieces could still be found. With partial DNA profiles, overlooked witness statements, and the faint shadow of a drifter who had vanished just as suddenly as the mother herself, the detective pressed forward. For the first time in years, the silence surrounding the case cracked, letting in the flicker of something the family thought they had lost forever: hope. The years had dragged on, but time had a way of forcing the family into new routines, even if none of them felt natural. The children, once teenagers caught in the middle of grief and suspicion, were now young adults trying to piece together lives of their own. Yet the shadow of their mother's disappearance never loosened its grip. Every milestone felt incomplete, every family gathering hollow. It was during one of those ordinary attempts at moving forward that everything changed. The eldest child had returned home for a weekend visit, sorting through boxes in the attic as part of a plan to finally declutter the house. The attic had always been more of a storage space than a living area, dusty, hot in summer, filled with holiday decorations, old-school projects, and forgotten furniture. Over the years it had become a place they rarely entered, too heavy with memories of the life they had before. That night, standing in the glow of a single bulb, the eldest pulled down another stack of boxes, brushing away years of dust. Something small slid loose from the insulation at the edge of the rafters and clinked faintly against the floor. At first, it seemed like nothing, a piece of metal, tarnished from time. But when the eldest bent down and picked it up, their breath caught. It was a bracelet, not just any bracelet, but the one their mother had worn every single day of her life. The silver charms were dulled, the clasp bent slightly, but it was unmistakable. The very piece she had been wearing the night she vanished. Shock turned quickly into confusion. How could it be here, in the attic of the very house she had left from that night? The family had searched every inch of her belongings years before. Police had combed the property. Yet here it was, wedged behind insulation, as though deliberately hidden. Dirt clung to the metal, fibers matted along its chain, suggesting it hadn't simply fallen there. This was placement, intentional or not, and the implications were devastating. The eldest stumbled downstairs, clutching the bracelet, their hands shaking. Their father froze when he saw it, his face draining of color. He whispered her name before collapsing into a chair, staring as though the object itself were alive. The siblings gathered around, each of them recognizing it instantly. For years they had waited for some sign, any proof of what had happened to their mother, and now the proof had appeared inside their own home. The police were called immediately. Within hours, detectives and forensic teams descended on the house, treating the attic as a fresh crime scene. Evidence markers were placed, insulation pulled back, boards examined. What they found unsettled everyone. Alongside the bracelet were faint stains in the wood, invisible to the naked eye but revealed under chemical spray. Trace fibers clung to nails and beams, some consistent with the clothing their mother had been last seen wearing. It was enough to change everything. For 8 years, the family had lived under the suspicion that something happened outside, on the trail, near the school, at the hands of a stranger. But this discovery pulled the focus back to the house, the very place that had been cleared long ago. Detectives who had once dismissed it as a dead end now realized the attic had never been a priority in the original investigation. It had been glanced at, yes, but never fully dismantled, never treated with the kind of scrutiny they used now. For the eldest, the discovery was both vindication and horror. On one hand, it proved their mother hadn't simply vanished into thin air. There was evidence, tangible and undeniable. On the other, it suggested that for nearly a decade, They had lived under the same roof as the truth, blind to it. The attic they had avoided all these years had been holding the secret they longed for, a secret too terrifying to imagine. Neighbors quickly learned of the discovery, and the atmosphere in town shifted overnight. Whispers spread, suspicion reignited, and the focus turned squarely back onto the family. If the bracelet had been in the attic all along, who had put it there? Why had it taken 8 years to find? And what did that mean about what really happened that evening? Detectives pressed harder than ever. They began reconstructing the original search, identifying exactly what parts of the home had been examined and which corners had been overlooked. Forensic specialists collected samples from the attic wood, analyzing them in labs that hadn't existed when the case first opened. The bracelet was dusted, swabbed, catalogued, every inch studied for DNA. For the family, the house no longer felt like home. The walls that once comforted them now felt like accomplices in silence. The attic no longer just storage, but a reminder of how close the truth had always been. The eldest child, who had stumbled upon the bracelet, was plagued with guilt. Guilt that they hadn't gone through those boxes sooner. Guilt that perhaps answers could have come years earlier. The case, once cold, was suddenly burning again. And though no one knew exactly what the bracelet would ultimately reveal, everyone understood one thing clearly. The story of that night was not what they had believed. The truth had been waiting above their heads, and now it was finally breaking through the silence. The discovery of the bracelet shifted the case into dangerous new territory. Detectives who had once exhausted every lead now narrowed their focus on one person who had remained constant throughout it all: the husband. For years he had lived under suspicion from the community, yet no evidence had ever tied him directly to his wife's disappearance. Now, with the bracelet and attic stains under review, detectives brought him back in for questioning, determined to press harder than ever before. At first, he repeated the same story he had given countless times. She left for her evening walk, he stayed home with the children, she never returned. He insisted the bracelet must have been misplaced, that perhaps it had been tucked away by accident years ago. But detectives weren't buying it. They laid out the photographs, chemical stains in the attic wood, the fibers consistent with her clothing, the dust-covered bracelet unearthed after nearly a decade. They told him that coincidences don't survive for 8 years, that the house he had lived in all this time was giving up its secrets piece by piece. The hours dragged on, the tone shifting from polite to relentless. Detectives reminded him of statistics, of how in most cases of spousal disappearance, the answer lies at home. They spoke of the children, of how they had lived under the weight of suspicion all these years, of how the truth was bound to surface whether he cooperated or not. The husband grew restless, his voice faltering, his composure slipping. Small details of his story began to waver. He stumbled on time frames, contradicted himself about whether he had searched the trail that first night. Investigators leaned in, sensing the cracks forming. Finally, after nearly 12 hours of questioning, the facade collapsed. His voice dropped, his shoulders slumped, and in a quiet, trembling admission, he told them what had happened. The evening of her disappearance had begun like so many others, but an argument had ignited between them, sharp words exchanged over household pressures that had built quietly for months. He described it as sudden, uncontrollable, an explosion of frustration that turned physical. In the heat of that moment, a shove, a strike, something irreversible happened. She fell, and the life was gone from her before he understood the weight of what he had done. Panic consumed him. The children were in the house, neighbors close by. He said he couldn't think, only react. Driven by fear of losing everything, he carried her body to the attic, searching for a place no one would ever look. Behind insulation and beams, he found a small crawl space, a void hidden between rafters and walls. He placed her there, sealing the space shut, convinced that if no one found her immediately, the evidence would fade with time. He believed the police would search the neighborhood, the woods, the trails, but not the house where grief seemed most obvious. And he was right. For 8 years, he lived with that secret above his head. Each time detectives questioned him, he clung to his story, framing himself as the grieving husband, the man left behind. He attended vigils, he accepted condolences, he even joined search parties, all while knowing the truth was a few feet above. He watched suspicion rise and fall, endured whispers and accusations, but through it all he maintained the mask, confident that the attic would never betray him. The detectives listened in silence as he recounted the details, some barely able to hide their disgust. What struck them most was not only the act itself, but the cold endurance of the cover-up. For nearly a decade, he had lived side by side with his children, watching them mourn, watching them ache, knowing he could end their torment with a single word, and choosing not to. The bracelet, dislodged after years of hiding, had undone everything. When the confession ended, the husband lowered his head onto the interrogation table and wept. But the tears carried no relief for investigators, and certainly not for the family. For his children, who had defended him, who had lived under the shadow of whispers, the truth was a shattering betrayal. The father they had trusted was not the victim of suspicion, but the perpetrator of the crime. Every year of grief, every unanswered question, every sleepless night replaying their mother's last moments, all of it had been a lie he had allowed them to carry while protecting only himself. Word spread quickly. The town that had grown weary of the case erupted with shock. Neighbors who had once defended him now looked back with horror at the moments they had shared with him. Borrowed tools, polite conversations, nods at the mailbox, all while he harbored the darkest of secrets. To many, the revelation was worse than the disappearance itself. She hadn't been taken by some faceless stranger. She'd been silenced within her own home, her body hidden in the very place her children had grown up, while her husband stood by, pretending to mourn with them. The confession marked the end of the mystery that had defined the town for nearly a decade. But for those closest to it, it wasn't closure. It was the breaking of an illusion, the unraveling of trust, and the beginning of a new kind of grief. The truth had surfaced at last, but in doing so, it destroyed the family left behind. When the confession ended, detectives wasted no time. A warrant was secured, and forensic teams returned to the house with tools and equipment prepared to unseal what had been hidden for nearly a decade. The attic, long ignored as just another storage space, became the center of the investigation. Boards were pried loose, insulation peeled back, and at last the sealed crawlspace was opened. The stench of time escaped into the air, heavy and suffocating, as investigators uncovered what remained of the woman who had once been the beating heart of that home. Her remains were fragile, reduced by years of concealment, but the items around her told the story her husband had kept silent. Scraps of clothing consistent with what she wore that night clung to her frame. The charm bracelet, discovered days earlier, had been dislodged from that very space. Proof of how close they had come to finding her so many times before. Forensic experts worked carefully, collecting every fragment, photographing every angle, treating the attic not only as a crime scene, but as a grave. After 8 years, the missing mother had finally been found, not in a distant field or by a stranger's hand, but within the walls of her own home. The news spread quickly through the community, and shock rippled across the small town. People who had once marched in vigils and taped posters to street lamps now reeled at the horrifying truth. All along, she had been just above their heads. Neighbors who had joined search parties through the woods, who had walked trails shoulder to shoulder with her husband, now struggled with disgust at how thoroughly they had been deceived. The man who had bowed his head at candlelight vigils, who had spoken of hope and grief, had been the very one responsible for the silence that tormented them. For the children, the revelation shattered the fragile balance they had built over the years. They had defended their father countless times against whispers and accusations, insisting that he was innocent, that he was as lost as they were. Now, sitting in that same house while investigators carried their mother's remains away, they were forced to face a truth more painful than her absence. The betrayal had come from within. The man they had trusted to keep them safe, the man who tucked them into bed after she vanished, had been the one who destroyed their family. Grief took on a new shape. For 8 years they had mourned in uncertainty, haunted by questions of whether their mother had suffered, whether she had been alive somewhere, whether she might one day walk through the door. Those questions were gone now, replaced by the brutal clarity of what had actually happened. There was relief in having answers, yes, but it was the kind of relief that cut deeper than silence. Closure came at the price of trust, and in some ways that wound was worse than the uncertainty had ever been. The authorities announced the recovery publicly, standing before cameras with solemn expressions. The county sheriff described the discovery as both heartbreaking and deeply disturbing. Reporters asked how the attic had been overlooked for so long, how evidence could remain hidden in plain sight. Investigators admitted their early focus had been outward, on the trail, on the possibility of an abduction. The attic had been glanced at, but never treated as a potential crime scene. It was a failure that haunted the department, a reminder of how assumptions can blind even experienced officers. The town grieved collectively, though the grief was complicated. Some were angry at the wasted years, furious that the husband had lived among them, sharing in their sorrow while guarding the secret. Others felt guilty for ever doubting the family, for turning suspicion toward the children or assuming the mother had left on her own. The revelation reframed everything, forcing people to relive the early days of the case with fresh eyes, seeing deception where they once saw despair. In court, the husband faced the full weight of his actions. His confession, combined with the physical evidence recovered from the attic, left little room for defense. Prosecutors painted a picture of a man who, in a moment of rage, had committed an irreversible act, then chosen self-preservation over truth. The children, now young adults, sat in the courtroom, listening to the details of their mother's final moments, their faces pale, their hands clasped tightly together. When the guilty verdict came, it was not met with cheers or celebration, only quiet sobs. Justice had been served, but the cost was immeasurable. For the family, life after the trial was marked by a strange duality. On one hand, the endless waiting was over, the questions answered, the mystery solved. On the other, the answers offered no comfort. The mother they had longed for was gone, her memory forever entangled with the horror of where she had been hidden. The home, once a place of warmth, had become unbearable. They eventually moved out, unable to live beneath the attic that had concealed the truth for so long. Her children carried her memory forward, but always with the shadow of their father's betrayal. They kept some of her belongings, the charm bracelet, cleaned and restored, the only piece salvaged from the darkness. They spoke of her at milestones, determined that her life would be remembered for more than its tragic end. Yet behind every memory was the unshakable reality that for 8 years they had grieved beside the man responsible, never knowing the truth was only steps away. The community, too, was left altered. The case became a cautionary tale, told for years after, a reminder that evil doesn't always arrive in the form of strangers lurking in the dark. Sometimes it lives within the walls of a home, hidden behind a smile, cloaked in routine. The idea unsettled many, leaving behind a permanent scar on the town's sense of safety. And so, after nearly a decade, the mystery was closed. The missing posters were no longer necessary, the vigils no longer held. The truth had been dragged from the shadows of the attic and laid bare, but in its place came no real peace, only the weight of knowing that the answers had been within reach all along, and that those answers would forever redefine what the family and the community thought they knew about love, trust, and safety.